We're set. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Today we'll discuss some events that occurred only 80 years ago, the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II. And I thought I'd like to ask you in the audience if you could raise your hands if you have a family member or if you know of someone who served in the military in World War II. Why don't you, Craig? Very good. Now, keep your hands up if they served in the Battle of the Atlantic. Do you know that for sure? A few of you do. Okay, very good. We want to salute those who served in that war and in that battle, and I'll give them a round of applause for sure. Now, Churchill labeled the fight between the British Royal Navy and the Karl Dönitz' German U-boats as the Battle of the Atlantic. That's where we got the terminology. And he called it the dominating factor all throughout the war. And it lasted the whole time of the war, the 6 years. And unfortunately, a lot of death caused by it. There were 3,500 Allied merchant ships that were sunk. There were 200 warships that were sunk. And on the other side, there were 800 U-boats sunk. And 60,000 seamen on both sides perished as a result of that. And that is surprisingly more than the casualties in all conflicts since the Romans. All ocean conflicts since the Romans 2,000 years before. So it was really a devastating attack and a war in the seas, to say the least. Now, when the war was announced, Britain announced and launched a blockade of Germany. And that was the day after the declaration of war in September of 1939. And given Germany's limited coast, as you can see from the map, that little red line there, the coastline was very limited for Germany to be able to get into the North Sea or the Atlantic Ocean. And so this blockade was expected to be a major impediment to Germany's ability to launch and succeed in this war. However, Britain, of course, was an island. And it was highly dependent on importing goods from all around its trading partners, including, the United States, and also including the Commonwealth nations, in particular like Canada. And there were almost more than 1 million tons a week imported into England for the population, the food and other things. So it was clear the Axis powers were going to attempt to, starve Britain. The Axis powers then being Germany and Italy, they would try to starve Britain by stemming the flow of this merchant shipping and the supplies to Britain. And the gray area on the map is the main marine lanes from the U.S., New York, etc., and Canada to Germany, to England. So it's quite obvious Germany could just focus on that area and could be able to deny England tremendous amount of supplies, to say the least. Now, we all know the story of the heroic and successful rescue efforts by fishing boats of the British troops who were stranded on the beach at Dunkirk. And that was in 1940, right after less than a year after the war. And once Germany had conquered France and the Low Countries, meaning Belgium and Netherlands, this defeat of those Allied powers, this quick defeat of those Allied powers, led Germany to even consider, or led Hitler to even consider much greater efforts. And so Hitler planned to invade England. And he was going to do it from two spots that he had conquered, Rotterdam in Holland and Calais in France. He would do an amphibious assault on Kent and Sussex. the coasts of Kent and Sussex in England. This was going to be called Operation Sea Lion. And it was Nazi Germany's code name for this planned invasion of the UK. It was going to take place during the Battle of Britain, and that's 9 months after the Second World War began. So it was very quick and very strong. Following the Battle of France and that country's capitulation, Hitler hoped, though, that the British government would cave, that they would accept his offer to end the state of war between Germany and England. He considered an invasion to be the last resort to be used, and only if all the other options had failed. Now, as a precondition for the invasion, though, Hitler said, we need both air and naval superiority in the Channel, over the Channel, and that was going to be very difficult to get. The German forces achieved none of those at any point during the war. The Royal Navy still had the Channel pretty well secure, and the landing sites in England were pretty well secured. And so as a result, he never really got what he needed for that. And furthermore, Hitler and his senior staff, his military leaders, all faced some serious doubts about the prospect for success, which is surprising. I was very surprised when I was reading the dossiers on that. Once Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union instead, he totally postponed any British invasion. And Britain, though, was bombed phenomenally. Mercilessly, phenomenally during the war, but an actual invasion never occurred. And if you think about it, England has endured tremendous number of invasions. Whether it would be, maybe we don't call them invasions. The Celts, they had a long invasion. The Romans did invade. The Anglo-Saxons came and settled. And then eventually in 1066, the Norman French. And all of those succeeded. After that, there was no successful invasion whatsoever. The Spanish Armada failed. Napoleon failed because of Trafalgar. And now Hitler was unable to do the same. So there was no successful invasions after that. But that's a good map because that shows you where they were planning on conquering, starting their invasion of England, to say the least. Now let's take a quick look at the map's geography during the war. What? There's a light flashing? Oh. It's causing stuff, okay. The dark purple areas are the German Axis nations. That's Germany and Italy with some colonies of Italy in Africa. The lighter purple is the conquests by these Axis powers. They obviously did very, very well. They got into the Soviet Union. They obviously took France. And they took, Norway and Sweden and Denmark. The tan powers are neutral countries. They sort of stayed out of the war in most cases. Although Spain was neutral, but Franco was very sympathetic to Hitler and Mussolini, and he allowed his people to do a lot of work for them in the effort. And the white are the Allies. And at this stage, the Allies are the Great Britain and Soviet Union. With some French colonies in France, down in Africa. So you can see the blue lines, which gave Germany its coastline for trade and to launch invasions or launch vessels to break into the Atlantic until they conquered France and the Low Countries. Because when they conquered those, then they had more areas to lead into the Atlantic and elsewhere. Two of these three routes, though, in the blue, are adjacent to the British Isles. That meant Britain could do some really good blocking if they wanted to. And so With that, Germany's best choice was the use of U-boats, because submarines which could reach the Atlantic unseen were the easy and quick way and cheap way, to some sense, build the invasion and to build, conquering of other areas. So let's take a look. Karl Dönitz is an important name in German military history. He was a captain in 1935 when he was appointed commander of the submarine force. He believed that subs were the only way, and maybe the best way, to assure German naval success. U-boats had been very close. The German U-boats had been very close to winning World War I for Germany and Austria, but they did not at that time. And now the subs were tougher, faster, and they could dive quicker. To some extent, they could dive in almost 30 seconds. And they had the thing that was really significant for change in the World War II was they had better short-wave radio communication that permitted Dönitz to come up with a lot of plans. He planned the wolf pack strategy. And we're going to talk about that. So the subs attacking in packs. And Dönitz calculated that all he needed was about 300 German U-boats, and he thought he could knock Britain out of the war. So, let's see. Here's the German boats, U-boats. He thought they were the one good way to counter that British blockade. And he hoped also they could also starve Britain into submission. And by 1939, Dönitz had convinced Hitler that he needed to build up the U-boat fleet, that it would be a vital aspect of the war. And the clincher that convinced Hitler that, yeah, maybe he was right, was a very successful attack by U-boat 47. They're all numbered, 47, in October of 1939, only a month after the war started. It crept into the British home fleet port of Scapa Flow, which we've seen, a lot of us at least have seen, in the Orkney Islands, which many of us have seen. And the U-boat was able to sneak into Scapa Flow, where the British fleet was always stationed during the wars, and it sunk the 50,000 battleship called Royal Oak. And that convinced Hitler, wow, maybe these were really good, important weapons, and so let's see what we can do with them. Now, once France was defeated, Germany created submarine bases along the coast of France on the Atlantic Ocean. And he did it in Brest, Lorient, and La Rochelle. And that's shown on the map, the three spots in red. This allowed U-boats to attack British ships, merchant ships, other ships bringing supplies to England. Further west in the Atlantic. They could get out further, and they could spend way more time on patrol. They built fortified concrete and steel U-boat pens, and that's what these boats are in right there, like the one shown here, and they were impervious to Allied bombing. We did not have the bombs that could break through those concrete structures. That worked until mid-1944. It was until 1944 when the Allies were able to develop a new type of bomb that could penetrate the concrete strongholds for these submarines, to say the least. Up to that point, the U-boats had immediate success in sinking British merchant ships, and the future looked very bleak for Britain at the beginning of the war. The British didn't realize that at about this time, though, Germany's resources were also being stretched very thin. And so with a little hindsight, we know a lot about what happened, but Dönitz was never able to get the funding for all the U-boats he wanted or thought he needed to win this war. And, you know, that was a problem Dönitz had with Hitler. Let's take a moment to focus on a couple of the places we visited so far on this cruise. Because in 1940, the Nazis had a secret dossier, which the Allies eventually got their hands on, which indicated that it was targeting areas in the northeast of England, which is where we just were, as part of their 1940 invasion plan. This is a highly productive part of Britain, Great Britain. It was integral to the supply of ships and armaments for the war effort. And this was a photo that was found in the dossier, and it shows a cargo ship passing under the Tyne Bridge in Newcastle upon Tyne. You saw this bridge, or one very similar to it, and World War II raged. Nazi Germany followed these plans and intensified their attacks in northeast England. In fact, here's one example. During 1941, this is in Newcastle. It was hit hard by the Nazi Luftwaffe and the rest. There was death and destruction in the port and in the surrounding areas. And on the evening of April 25th, 1941, a series of high explosive bombs, showers of incendiaries, and surprisingly a parachute mine was dropped from the darkened skies on Newcastle. The bombs were intended for industrial targets, but as often as in the war, they went astray, and civilians paid the price. They were casualties as well. And as a result, the air raids on Newcastle during World War II killed about 141 civilians and injured 600 more. Now, this photo shows a devastated Guildford Place in Heaton, Newcastle, following the deadly April 25th air raid. And I want to show you what it is today. Once the war ended, England was able to rebuild. This is the same Guildford Palace, 80 years after the Nazi attack. And if you look down the row of houses there, you can see some of the older homes that were still standing on the attack at the end. They had not been destroyed. Southampton wasn't spared either. The above left photo shows the bombarded warehouses in the inner docks of the city in 1940. Fortunately, the entire area today has been rebuilt and boasts state-of-the-art shipping, warehousing, and prime cruise port facilities, which we've been using, as we saw. And you can see some of that in the other pictures. So, I mean, England has been able to recoup, obviously, but they suffered dramatically and really frighteningly. The ports took real hits from the German Luftwaffe and also from some of the the naval ships that came up close into the ports. During World War II, 1/3 of the world's merchant shipping was British. And unfortunately, between 1939 and 1945, 2,400 British ships were sunk, and more than 30,000 merchant marines lost their lives. So that was a major loss, and not just being in the military, but if you were a merchant marine on trading ships, you faced some real risks because you were targets, to say the least, for the Luftwaffe and the German Navy. So Britain looked back in history to learn about one successful tactic that the Dutch had used to protect them against pirate attacks. And that, and one of those pirates, we should mention, was Sir Francis Drake, an Englishman. Ironically, they were protecting themselves against British pirates. Before 1639, naval confrontations were highly chaotic. They had individual vessels firing guns that were mounted in their bows, and the Dutch decided that this wasn't very successful. And so they decided to put all their vessels in a line of a battle arrangement and open broadside with cannonades. And that was a way that they could hopefully deter the pirates. This came to be known as ships of the battle line or battleships. That's where we got the term battleships from the Dutch forming these sort of convoy type approaches. Eventually, Britain adopted this convoy system, which allowed its Royal Navy to concentrate escorts. So the Royal Navy became the escorts to, the naval ships became the escorts to protect 30 to 70 unmanned merchant marines, unarmed merchant marines, sorry. The British aircraft also were able to provide an additional umbrella sometimes to protect the ships below. And Britain was following then not only the example of the Dutch, but it was also following the example of the Spanish treasure fleets. If you think about after Columbus and the Spanish were conquering parts of South America and getting the silver mines from the Incas and the rest, well, they took their treasure back to Spain, but they were being attacked by pirates. This time the pirates were Dutch and English, and in the 15th and 17th centuries. And so there was a convoy. The convoy system was fairly effective to protect the merchant marines. Now, the British Royal Navy initially tried to protect the merchant marine ships sailing from North America. And they helped protect them so that they could get the convoy, if you wish, to Oban, Scotland, which you can see way on the map, and to the north, because Oban, Scotland was farther away than the German Luftwaffe could bomb. And so it was protected in some ways as a port, except from from naval attacks. But it was out of the range of the Luftwaffe attacks. And the direct route on the map is highlighted yellow. And the line on the map that arch over the direct route shows the safer routes, which are highlighted in blue. And that's because it's even further away from the German U-boats. And they probably couldn't stay up in that area without refueling, et cetera, so they had to get back to a German port to some extent. Dönitz' wolf pack strategy had the U-boats spread out in a long line across the projected course of an Allied convoy, where they could attack en masse and overwhelm the escorts. And while the escorts might try, the British Navy escorts might try to chase the U-boats away, the rest of the Wolfpack U-boats could attack the merchant ships with impunity. With no one there to protect the merchant ships. This strategy, however, of Dönitz's required extensive radio communications between the subs and the headquarters of the subs to coordinate their attacks. And this is where we come to the modern era. Germany thought these communications were very safe, since their radio messages were encrypted using what this is called the Enigma cipher machine, which was considered unbreakable. 3 rotors were changed every day with a system of key sheets. And British code breakers thought this could not be broken either. They were faced a big wall to do anything there. But on May 9th, 1941, the British destroyer Bulldog captured and boarded U-boat 110 and was able to recover its cryptological material, including the keys to the sub's Enigma machine. And the crew of that U-boat were interred so quickly that they failed to be able to communicate back to headquarters that they had been caught and that the Enigma machine had been taken by the British. So the Germans didn't know. They did not know that one of their Enigma machines with keys had already been taken by the British. And so what we have is Bletchley Park is the home of British intelligence during the war. And it's interesting, most of the people who worked on the data there were women, and they were called computers. You called the women computers. That was their terminology, their titles, so to speak. Now, these code breakers were able to take, the women code breakers were able to take the newfound knowledge from the capture of the U-boat, and they helped break some new keys as the German army changed them. In an October of 1942, material was salvaged. The British were able to salvage material from another U-boat that they captured, and that enabled somebody else to do something quite amazing. That enabled a mathematician by the name of Alan Turing to go further and break new Nazi codes. Alan was a renowned mathematician whose instrumental work on code breaking thoroughly broke the Enigma code used by both the Germans, and the Japanese used it too. The Enigma intercepts enabled the British to plot the positions of all the U-boats, where the convoys were, where they were lining up, etc. And they could route the British merchant marine around them so that they weren't getting attacked. The merchant ships dropped, the losses of the merchant ships dropped by over 2/3 in July of 1941 and remained low for the rest of the war. Later, Turing was honored with his face, as you can see on the British pound notes, and he's one of the few non-royals to be able to get that honor. And very well known, and the Queen, in a sense, knighted him in some ways. Britain did come up with other improvements also for anti-submarine warfare, such as improving early sonar, because early sonar could initially be fooled by thermoclines or eddies or even schools of fish. And sonar, this early sonar, was only effective at low speeds, since above 15 knots, where the ships are going above 15 knots, the noise of the engine would drown out the echoes for the sonar. Once the U.S. was in the war, Britain, of course, shared all this technology with U.S. military, and the two worked very closely together to improve sonar and other anti-submarine weapons. Now, here's some of those weapons. Depth charges. Depth charges required the ship to pass over the submarine so that it could roll the depth charges from the stern or from chutes that are on the sides of the ship. And they would lay a pattern. It's like an elongated diamond, hopefully with the sub in the middle of the pattern. The charge would explode within 20 feet, though. It had to explode within 20 feet to be effective, however. So this was a really not a sure-fired way of getting the sub. The newest technology was called the Hedgehog. This was a new improved forward-throwing weapon, anti-sub weapon. It could fire up to 24 mortars ahead of the ship, ahead of the British ship as it was moving. And with contact fuses, it would explode when they hit a hard surface. The Hedgehog had a kill ratio of about 6-to-1, whereas the depth charges had a kill ratio of 60-to-1. So you can see that Hedgehog was a major improvement and very successful during the war, say the least. In May of 1941, the new German battleship Bismarck was launched, and the cruiser Prince Eugen, they set sail to attack convoys. They were Their mission was to attack the convoys of British merchant marines. Bismarck was the largest battleship ever and the most sophisticated. It was an amazing piece of work by the German Navy. The British fleet, however, was able to intercept the battleships off Iceland. Unfortunately, the battleship, or the British battle cruiser HMS Hood, was blown up, and you can see that on the map in the top, where the Hood got to the left of Iceland there. It was sunk by the Bismarck because the Bismarck had a phenomenally greater range of artillery. They could stand way back far from the other ships, launch their artillery. They could not be hit, but they could destroy other ships as a result. The yellow arrow shows where the Hood was sunk. But the Bismarck itself was damaged in that battle and raced to return to France for repairs, as shown on the map. As you can see, the red line, it's trying to get back to France pretty quickly. It never made it. It was disabled by an airstrike of the British Air Force and sunk eventually by the British Navy, the Royal Navy. This was an extremely heavy cost for Germany. That battleship took a lot of technology and was very expensive to build, too. This convinced Hitler that you can't use warships to raid convoys. And this map shows the routes taken by all of them. And Prince Eugen, the cruiser, got back safely, but Bismarck was gone. And there was not going to be a second Bismarck during the war. Germany didn't have the resources to be able to do that again. Now, this map is a little confusing, and it just shows the extensive routes of convoys. The Battle of the Atlantic, as I mentioned, was the longest battle of World War II, running from the start of war in 1939 to the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. Goernitz was frustrated that the priority for steel and equipment wasn't given to him for the U-boats. Instead, it was given to the Army and the Luftwaffe. And he never was able to really make more subs. And here's something that's really an interesting statistic. He never really had more than 14 subs in the Atlantic at any one time. Quite amazing. We all assumed he had fleets of them like mad. And by May of 1943, Goernitz called off the North Atlantic wolf packs by saying, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." Let's see why. And let's see why he lost it. Goernitz's aim was to sink Allied shipping faster than they could be replaced. But as the sinkings by the U-boat fell and the U.S. production of new ships rose, this became impossible. On this chart, the black dots show the tonnage of ships sunk by U-boats before Germany started using secret coding. The red dots show the success of the Enigma code to sink a much greater number of British ships. The blue dots show that once the Enigma code was broken and better radar technology was developed by the Allies, the number of sinkings by U-boats declined dramatically. And after D-Day, Germany also lost all their bases in France and Europe. So the U-boats had to make longer trips to get into the Atlantic to attack the convoys. It meant there was less sorties in the Atlantic. So by that time, maybe the die was cast, but they were not winning the war in the Navy and in the Atlantic Ocean, etc. The convergence of technological advances and increased U.S. production of warships ended the risk of loss, really, by U-boats. The blue dots show the dramatic increase in U-boats sunk after the Enigma code was broken. Of the 40,000 U-boat sailors, German U-boat sailors, 30,000 never returned. They perished as their U-boats, as their subs were sunk. This is a list of all the sinkings, or most of the sinkings. Once the U.S. entered the war and increased production of warships occurred, the German U-boats, which had been the hunters, became the hunted instead. And the map charts this huge number of U-boats that were lost, mainly in the Atlantic. Now, the battle became a war of tonnage, and the Allies' resources won the day. The U-boats sank 6,000 ships, totaling over 21 million tons. But the Allies were able to build over 38 million new tons in 27 and 10 Liberty ships, vastly exceeding the tonnage that the U-boats were able to sink during the war. And this chart gives you a great example of that. In 1941, even though we want to talk a little bit about Iceland too, in 1941, even the U.S., even though nominally neutral, extended the Pan-American security zone as far as Iceland. And the U.S. presence in Iceland and Greenland discouraged the Germans from attacking at that time. And so it's very interesting, though, with the exception of the Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands, off of Alaska, the Battle of the Atlantic was the only battle to touch North American shores, because the U-boats were able to enter the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. Otherwise, the U-boats would stay outside the U.S. limit, the sea boundaries, and just wait for their chance to attack the ships coming and going as they went in and out of ports. And, they were successful in sinking a lot of U.S. ships as a result of that. Here's Iceland. Great Britain, with Canadian troops, invaded Iceland in May of 1940 after Germany had occupied Denmark. And in July of 41, the U.S. troops were asked to relieve the British troops, and we did. We stationed a force of 60,000 in the country to defend Iceland and keep Germany from taking control, because Iceland was a strategic location for the war and naval bases in the Atlantic. The U.S. forces, and we're going to talk about this when I talk about the politics of how Iceland evolved 2 lectures from now. The U.S. forces brought employment, prosperity, unfortunately, though, high inflation to the population in Iceland, and the population only numbered about 120,000, and we added 60,000 troops to the number. But we did put very important 5 Marconi wireless stations were established on the west coast of Iceland, which was vital for attacks and our ability to, once we broke the Enigma codes, to know where the German U-boats were. Now, this next slide is an important slide. And it's brought to you by the American Optometry Association. And I want you all to memorize it because it'll be on the exam. Okay? This is the difference between the British Navy and the German Kriegsmarine. And I don't know about you, but I can't tell very much difference between some of these ships. Can you imagine how difficult it is for a seaman to see a ship on the distant horizon and be able to determine whether it was friend or foe? Because it's vital for them to be able to do that. They have to memorize the profile of these ships to determine friend for foe for their own survival and for the success of their mission. So it's a really confusing. I mean, to me, they all look somewhat the same. So it would be a problem. But then again, I don't have probably the best eyesight, so that'd be one excuse. Anyway, public focus is usually focused on and centered on U-boat successes, the aces, the scores, the convoys attacked, and the ships sunk. But this camouflages the U-boat strategy failures. And the enlarged barcode here shows the rapid increase of U-boat losses, which are in orange, versus the Allied ship losses, which are in green, as the war progressed. At no time were the supply lines to Britain fully interrupted. Only 10% of the convoys were attacked, and only 10% of those ships were lost. Most ships lost by the U-boats were not in convoys, but the loners who had been separated from the convoys. And 99% of all the ships that traveled in the Atlantic traveled successfully. Now, this does not lessen, though, the terrible loss of life and supplies that the U-boats did cause to Britain, to say the least. And this is only one picture where you can see in the barber shop, you've got horse flesh being sold because there wasn't enough cattle, there wasn't sheep, et cetera, et cetera. It was very difficult to make sure you had adequate supplies. German U-boat blockades did severely reduce Britain's home front provisions, no question about it. Luftwaffe attacks on merchant ships from bases in France were also very successful in blocking supplies from reaching Britain. Now, even this picture, though, doesn't show the worst possible end result. Anyone have an idea why? Why this picture doesn't show that the world was coming to a final end in Britain? They had pets. There were 4 patrons here who brought their dogs with them. Now, animals in the zoo were usually prime targets. Zoos were not, some of the animals in the zoo were cleaned out for food. But people still had their dogs. Look at that. They had their pets. And they were able to keep them throughout the war. So, you know, it was terrible. None of us would want to live through it, but, you know, it wasn't the end of the world. They didn't start cannibalizing their pets or each other, that's for sure. You know, unfortunately, horses were part of the food supply. The desperate times call for desperate measures, as they say, but certain pets were certainly able to survive, and that was quite amazing. Anyway, as you probably know, D-Day was the name given for the American and British invasion, coordinated invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe in 1944. The defeat of the U-boats was vital to allow the Allies to build up the supplies they needed and the troops they needed for this breakthrough. These armed forces needed overwhelming strength in men and aircraft to be able to defeat the German wall, the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's Atlantic Wall, that was manned by Erwin Rommel. And without that vast amount of British troops, American troops, etc., the aircraft and supplies, D-Day could not have succeeded, but succeed it did. And as you can see from this map, once the Allies invaded, once they landed in Normandy, they were able to move into and across the continents pretty quickly, and they finally were able to liberate occupied Europe, eventually pushing the Axis powers out of the war, and the tide had turned totally toward an Allied victory in the war. And the Battle of the Atlantic, as I said, lasted the full 6 years of the war. It finally ended in 1945. And with that, there's a number of older movies that provide very good insights into life on the U-boats at this time. And I do recommend Das Boot, German film. Very insightful picture of life in a U-boat. And there are, of course, many U.S. propaganda films exclaiming the courage of the Allies in the battle against those U-boat silent killers. And The Enemy Below is just one of those films. but has two great actors in it, so it works pretty well. So I want to thank you for coming this evening. And before I want to step down, I want to let you know that my next presentation will be tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And it'll be on Icelandic history that is dictated by geology and geography. And so with that, I thank you all for coming and hope you enjoyed it.